Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here, and the latest entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe just hit theaters. Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania. It's a crazy title, it's a crazy movie, so let's talk about it. So I'm an Ant-Man fan. I know it's sort of like a minority opinion when it comes to the MCU, but Ant-Man's one of my favorites of the heroes for a lot of the reasons why I think other people he's maybe their least favorite. But just the character, he's sort of this like delightfully simplistic, silly character. Just hey, he's a guy. He can shrink into the size of an ant. Have fun with that. And kind of like the kind of his initial couple of movies really played into this, like that playful simplicity, just sort of having fun with like the Honey I Shrunk Your Kids kind of hijinks and adventure, and just sort of the smaller stakes, which at least to me was sort of this refreshing contrast to the more like cosmic scope and powers of all the other kind of Marvel heroes. So in some ways, I think at least the first two Ant-Man films kind of reflected the spirit, the simplistic kind of small scale of the character. But if you've been following the story, you know that eventually his character also learned the ability to grow and to become a kind of giant, towering, to kind of grow, to change size in the other direction. And Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, kind of like the first film, kind of echoed the shrinking ability. This very much seems to kind of reflect, to echo the growing ability. This sort of thrusts this sort of small hero into this massive kind of crank to 11 otherworldly conflict with this sort of wide cosmic stakes, not just for the world, but for all worlds and timelines and multiverse. And so this is definitely, this movie definitely goes big. But sadly, at least to me, the result, kind of the end result of that decision is just an equally giant-sized mess. This is not a good movie. Again, I think with all these sort of things, personal tastes will kind of vary on what you want from an MCU movie, what you want from an Ant-Man movie, just what you want from like a superhero or blockbuster kind of movie. But to me, Quantumania kind of leans in to all the worst qualities of the MCU, all the things that I feel like are the weak elements rather than like the strengths. This film kind of leans hard into all of those. And sort of that like bombardment of just sort of hollow CGI spectacle, a plot that very much seems like it exists merely to establish further stories and movies and shows, and rather than kind of being a contained thing that works on its own, and just kind of like a surprisingly joyless, sarcastic tone throughout, and just this sort of more is more approach that just kind of mistakes this throwing bizarre, crazy, more big things, kind of mistakes that for fun or entertainment or for depth, and even sort of the endlessly fun potential of the shrinking ability, which they just played around with in a lot of kind of innovative ways so far throughout the earlier films. Even that just sort of lacks any sense of sort of cleverness or inventiveness. Even like I think in probably an unintentionally meta scene, Paul Rudd, the Ant-Man, essentially explains to his daughter that it's really all just about shrinking, punching, growing, and getting the momentum and repeat, and that's sort of all there is to it. And that seems like all the film really does with that ability. Nothing that we haven't kind of seen before, nothing fun in that way. But speaking of Paul Rudd, this movie isn't all bad. There are some positives kind of throughout this thing, and the main one is Paul Rudd. He kind of continues to just sort of be overpoweringly charismatic, kind of almost single-handedly making this film enjoyable and watchable. This film has a lot of issues, but Paul Rudd is never one of those issues, so I think he is good in this. And he's also joined this time by Jonathan Majors, who sort of seems to be in every movie these days. He's sort of having his moment. And he plays the role of Kang the Conqueror, which seems like they're setting him up to be sort of the successor of Thanos as the new kind of big baddie that's going to go across all the Marvel kind of stories and like the overarching Avenger narrative. And Majors himself, he's a superb actor. He's been good in lots of things, and I think he's good here as well. And his character Kang has some sort of interesting hints of like depth and layers and elements that you sort of want to know more about in his character. Although, kind of the unfortunate side of that is that it seems because they're setting him up to be the big bad in like a bunch of stories, that they're sort of saving a lot of the exploration of those themes and like the layers and the interest stuff in his character for later films, which just sort of makes him not as interesting this time as I think maybe he could have been. But like I said, unfortunately, kind of outside of Paul Rudd and outside of like some of the like the potential of Kang's character, and there is some funny gags and humor that you would hope from an Ant-Man movie. Outside of those elements, really nothing else works. This sort of relentless kind of more is more approach just sort of muddies this whole thing up. Kind of this stew of disconnected ideas or distracting subplots that don't really tie into the bigger picture. And it's just a lot of stuff. Like the visuals is tons of visuals coming at you, although it's sort of unimpressive, hollow. It looks like characters standing on a soundstage looking at like green tennis balls rather than ever feeling like an immersive world. And even the characters, like this film kind of constantly introduces more people, more characters, and then sidelines them or forgets them or moves on to the next thing, and more characters to introduce. Like Bill Murray shows up in this. Which, hey, Bill Murray is never a bad thing to throw in a movie, but he's in an extended scene in this, and then he's not in it anymore. The scene doesn't really even tie into it has no real purpose to the story other than getting Bill Murray in it. But then we never return to him, never sort of follow up on that storyline. And kind of similarly, the heroes, when they first get to the quantum realm, they meet a bunch of sort of the natives, the people that are living in this realm, and there are a bunch of kind of interesting, quirky characters, and then they are quickly put to the side for like the next hour and a half of this movie until they're needed at the very end so that they can have sort of a bigger scope, a bigger battle, so they go get them back again, but don't follow any of that kind of thread of their characters. And probably the most egregious is kind of, despite having her name now in the title, Evangeline Lilly's Wasp character is almost entirely sidelined. She has nothing of consequence really to do anything throughout this entire story other than to kind of emote as characters sort of give her these like exposition kind of backstory dumps. So definitely kind of wasted her character as well. And speaking of exposition, this movie is just packed to the brim of it. There is so much explaining that goes on in this. Like kind of anytime the movie seems like it's sort of inching forward in the plot, it quickly comes screeching to a halt as characters need to fill the audience in on sort of who this character is or what this place is or why this is important or what happened in the past, and just sort of this constant kind of parade of backstories, because everyone gets one. Kang, he gets like a flashback backstory of sort of who he is and where he came from and kind of how he became the Conqueror. Michelle Pfeiffer's Janet character, she gives sort of several long kind of monologue exposition dumps of like her time in the quantum realm and kind of what happened in the past and her relationship to some of like the villains and the world. So there's that. Even like a previous sort of MCU character returns, surprisingly returns in the form of like a big floating head, and he gets a backstory. You kind of hear how he became who he is, and even like at the kind of near the very end, like, a bunch of ants suddenly become relevant to the story, seemingly because, hey, this is an Ant-Man movie, we need ants, so they throw those in at the very end to kind of add to the spectacle. And guess what? They get a backstory. Even the ants get a sort of a flashback to sort of how they became who they are for this final scene, although they don't really even do anything. So it's sort of, there's so much of just sort of that backstory and exposition, but kind of the irony of that is that the story itself kind of feels directionless. It kind of feels like, because there's so many other unrelated plots, that the story itself struggles to have any kind of clear themes or direction or character arcs or just sort of cohesion, kind of leaving the whole thing to feel like this movie is essentially just a big setup, a big backstory for Kang so that we can use him kind of in further stories. As far as things kind of going on the surface of this thing, kind of some content to consider. Language, kind of what you expect at this point from a Marvel movie. There is sort of frequent minor profanities, S and D and H and all those that are quite common, although there's no like F word. There's multiple kind of uses of God's name in vain, like OMG and, my God, and those sort of things get used quite often in this as well. There's a repeated gag where characters use like a crude word for male genitals, sort of as this joke, and they kind of keep repeating it back and forth. And then maybe another thing that isn't necessarily language, but there is sort of this like goo-like alien character that's just sort of fascinated with like how many holes humans have, because he has no holes, and they kind of play it for humor. And it doesn't come across super as crude as maybe it could have, but again, that's in there as well. Violence, typical Marvel violence. This sort of the extent is that a couple of characters get kind of bloodied as they fist fight, but nothing beyond that. Sexuality, not a whole lot, thankfully, in this one. Maybe about the only thing that comes to mind is there is sort of a married couple who's been separated in different dimensions for 30 years, and they're reunited, and they're kind of reminiscing on some of that, and they talk openly about sexual encounters that they had during those 30 years, not with each other, and both seem to be perfectly okay with the fact that they were sleeping with other people outside of marriage because they both have needs. And so there's that. They kind of make light of that, although that's just sort of in one scene, but nothing like visually as far as sexuality goes. As far as themes, kind of things going on beneath the surface of this, like I said, this isn't necessarily this is a film that has a lot of like threads, but not necessarily one that like pursues them down to any kind of depth or interesting ways. But probably the one kind of consistent element throughout this movie is just sort of this theme of time, and like how different characters view time, how they relate to time, how for some time is sort of a blessing, for other characters time is more of like a curse or like a burden. Because at the start of this film, Scott Lang, aka Ant-Man, is kind of living in the past. He's coasting on his glory. He saved the universe. Now he's just sort of writing books and doing library tours and just sort of enjoying the fact that he saved the world, that he's a hero. And kind of his very like activist-minded daughter reprimands him for not living in the moment and not being concerned about like the future and what's happening, just sort of living in the past. And kind of the sense that like Scott Lang has like he's lived well, but he's not currently living well, at least in the eyes of his daughter. And kind of related to that, there's a sense of just sort of lost time, and it's sort of explored through almost all the characters in some sense for different reasons. There's sort of Scott Lang and his daughter, like the lost memories that they sort of had together because of the Thanos snap, and because he's off fighting, being a hero, and he missed birthday parties and stuff. And then like Hank Pym and Janet, the married couple, they were separated, and then Janet and her daughter, and kind of all of them sort of in this movie are dealing with sort of some of that regret or hurt or just sort of the disappointment that they missed opportunities to spend with each other. And kind of similarly, but from like the other perspective, is Kang himself is sort of more literally at war with time. His abilities aren't necessarily fully explained, but he possesses kind of the power, or at least the technology, to step outside of time, and kind of speaks about like, by doing so, he can kind of realize what a small prison time is, and he sort of transcends time. But as the film goes on, it becomes evident that like, by not experiencing time as it was intended to be experienced, that this knowledge is kind of more it's not a blessing; it's like more of like a burden that he bears. And in some ways, it kind of echoes even like the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. And King is, because of stepping out of time, he's accused of like one of the characters accuses him of like elevating himself to be a god, and it does reflect some of like the plight of Adam and Eve, that like to be like God, they sort of sought this knowledge, the knowledge of God, but like the consequences of that, rather than kind of enlightening them and leading to kind of the happiness, it actually became a burden and a curse that they had to it was too much for them to bear, which is sort of King's storyline throughout this, because he alludes several times like he knows how everything ends, and there's sort of this burden of knowing the future that really is like the motivation for him to go conquer, and sort of his like obsession with time and stuff, and sort of this cosmic view of time, which prevents him from appreciating just sort of the good things, the small moments in life. So I think maybe that's sort of, as far as thematically, this film sort of has this message that, hey, we're all at war with time, we all deal with time, but the difference is how we relate to time. And again, this is a biblical theme. Ephesians 5, Colossians 4, Ecclesiastes 3:1, all throughout the Bible, there is a motif of sort of living well, not taking time for granted. And there is sort of a touching moment at the end of this film where like the victorious heroes are celebrating a birthday for Cassie, Scott Lang's daughter, despite the fact that like it's not her actual birthday. And it's sort of this idea that, like, hey, life is meant to be lived forward, moving kind of forward momentum. And although like time can like steal opportunities, time itself also sort of prevents opportunities to make new memories, to live well, and kind of look more towards the future. So I do think it is sort of a positive theme, although I don't think the film itself necessarily deals with it with a whole lot of depth. So in the end, again, especially with these sort of movies, people are going to have different opinions. People will have different expectations. But at least to me, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, kind of feels like the MCU is at a crossroads. Kind of the overarching big story and like multi-connected narrative that I feel like used to sort of give deeper meaning and like stakes and purpose to the individual stories. Now it seems like it just sort of sucks the life out of each of these stories. Where this movie just feels like, hey, it's almost homework so that you can understand King and the future stories, rather than being sort of an enjoyable character arc and journey on its own. I think for me, this is sort of a classic lesson of, hey, sometimes less is more. Sometimes it's better to go smaller rather than bigger, which, hey, a movie about ants maybe should have already understood that lesson. But hey, if you guys see this movie, if you guys have a different opinion, let me know. Let's have a conversation about this in the comment section. Did you enjoy this? Were you sort of let down by this? Are you still very kind of all in with the MCU and the direction it's going? Or maybe are you more like me and kind of getting a little disenfranchised with sort of the big stakes, and everything has to be tied into some bigger purpose? Love to have that conversation. If you guys haven't done so too, encourage you, subscribe to our channel, like the video, just join with what we're doing here. We'd love to have you be a part of it. But thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.